When you think of Bethesda, the first thing that probably comes to mind is massive open world RPGs. Games where you can go anywhere, be anyone, and do practically anything. But there's something that often goes unspoken. Despite their incredible worlds, their storytelling has struggled to reach the same heights. If you've played Starfield, Bethesda's latest release, you've probably noticed this. It's a game of massive scale, packed with plans to explore and secrets to uncover. But the main story? It felt a little thin, almost secondary to everything else. Sure, you're wrapped up in a grand universal conspiracy, but does that narrative actually leave a lasting impact? The same can be said about Fallout 4. The plot starts with a bang, the world has collapsed, and at the same time, your child has been kidnapped. But as the game progresses, the urgency fizzles out, and the narrative takes a backseat to everything else the game has to offer. Then we have Skyrim, a game that is often considered Bethesda's crowning achievement, not just by fans, but by the entire gaming community. The world of Skyrim is a masterpiece of design, a living, breathing space where you can lose yourself for hours without ever touching the main quest. The sense of freedom is intoxicating, the landscapes are breathtaking, and the discovery is endless. But here's where the conversation shifts. For all of Skyrim's undeniable strengths, its main story is at best forgettable, and that's a hard truth to accept for many who hold this game in such high regard. But think about it, you play as the Dragonborn, a hero destined to defeat Alduin, the World Eater, and save all of Tamriel from destruction. It's an epic premise, sure, but as you journey through the main story, does it ever feel epic? Does Alduin ever seem like the world-ending force he's meant to be? Of course, Skyrim has its moments, but more often than not, the answer is no. The sense of urgency, of high stakes, just doesn't land the way it should. The game's world might be teeming with life, but the narrative itself feels strangely hollow. It's a straightforward path. You find out you're the Dragonborn, you learn some shouts, you kill a few dragons, and then you stop Alduin. There's no real complexity, no real weight to your actions, and no genuine conflict beyond kill the bad dragon. It's a borderline cliché story about good and evil, with a generic chosen one hero and significant plot armor to go along with it. This is where Bethesda's more recent games start to show a pattern. It's not that they've forgotten how to tell stories, but the focus has shifted. The narrative has become secondary to the world, and while world building is arguably Bethesda's greatest strength, it comes at the cost of the very thing that should hold the game together and push players deeper, the story. And that's the heart of this video. Today we're exploring why Bethesda, a studio that has created some of the most iconic RPGs in history, has struggled to deliver a truly compelling main story in their more recent titles. Now, before we begin, I just want to say I'm unbelievably grateful for the growth of this channel recently. It's amazing to see my videos reach such a wide audience, especially the thousands of you who are returning viewers. With that, I'd just like to ask, if you do enjoy the content I put out, it would mean a lot to me if you would subscribe, as less than 0.1% of you are actually subscribed. To really grasp where Bethesda's storytelling falls short, we first need to explore what makes a truly great story, especially within the context of a video game, as the medium definitely dictates our expectations. In an RPG, we're not just passive observers, we're participants, and that involvement changes everything about how we experience a narrative. From there, we dive into Bethesda's most recent titles to pinpoint where their storytelling has fallen short. Then we'll turn back to their earlier games to see if at any point they managed to deliver a narrative that's as rich and as compelling as the open worlds they're so well known for. To understand what makes a truly great story in a video game, we first need to consider what storytelling in this medium requires. As I mentioned before, games aren't just passive entertainment. They're an interactive experience that demands the player's involvement. This means that a great story in a game doesn't just unfold in front of you, it engages you, drawing you into its world through characters, choices, stakes, and emotion. Let's break this down to understand what this truly means, using some of the finest examples of storytelling in video games. At the heart of every great story are its characters. No matter how exciting the plot, without compelling, multidimensional characters, a story will fall flat. In video games, this is even more important because players spend hours interacting with these characters. Take The Witcher 3 for example, a masterclass in character-driven storytelling. Geralt of Rivia is a gruff, no-nonsense protagonist with incredible amounts of depth, but what makes the game exceptional is the depth of the characters around him. Yennefer, Triss, Ciri, and even the side characters like Zoltan and Dandelion feel fully realized, with distinct personalities, motivations, and emotional arcs. The relationships you build with these characters aren't static, they evolve based on your choice, and the game makes you feel connected to them on a deeply personal level. Every interaction feels important because the characters are more than just dialogue options, they're integral to the story's emotional core. A great story in a video game isn't just about characters though, it's about giving the players agency. I've touched on this in a previous video, where I discussed how Bethesda frequently struggles to provide meaningful player agency. In many ways, this is what sets video game storytelling apart from other mediums. Unlike in a film or book, where the audience passively observes, a video game allows the player to influence the story, but for this to be meaningful, the choices offered must have real weight. The player's decision needs to shape the world and the narrative in real, impactful ways. Once again, a brilliant example of this is The Witcher 3. The choices you make throughout the game, whether it's the main quest or in the side stories, have genuine, often unexpected consequences. Take, for example, the Bloody Baron questline. Your decisions as Geralt don't just determine the outcome of the Baron's story, they have ripple effects that are felt throughout the game. The consequences are not binary or simple, they're morally grey, and the game forces the player to grapple with the impact of their choices in ways that feel authentic and deeply intertwined with the narrative. While character and choice are essential, a truly great story also requires a gripping plot, one that builds tension, raises stakes, and keeps the player invested from beginning to end. Consider The Last of Us. From the opening scene, the stakes are clear. Joel's world is torn apart by loss, and the game never lets up on the emotional and physical tension. Every moment of the story feels urgent, whether you're dealing with personal trauma or fighting for survival in a post-apocalyptic world. The plot is structured in a way that constantly builds towards moments of intense emotional payoff, keeping the player on edge. The story of Joel and Ellie is one that grips you not just because of its premise, but because of the way the narrative continually escalates, making you care deeply about the characters and the world with each passing moment. Another defining characteristic about great storytelling is creating an emotional connection. The best stories leave a lasting impact because they evoke powerful emotions. Whether it's joy, sorrow, anger, or fear, emotional resonance comes from the characters and the stakes that the player cares about, as well as the moments in the story that tap into universal human experiences. In Red Dead Redemption 2, Arthur Morgan's journey is one of the most emotionally powerful narratives, not just in gaming, but across all forms of storytelling media. His internal conflict is at the heart of the game's emotional weight. His relationships with other characters, especially with John Marston and Sadie Adler, are filled with tension, warmth, and heartbreak. And by the end of the story, there's a profound sense of loss and redemption that leaves a lasting emotional impact. It's not just these events of the story that matter, it's the emotional journey that you take with Arthur that makes the game so powerful. Finally, one of the most crucial elements of a great story is the world it's set in. World building in a game goes beyond creating visually impressive settings. It's about creating a world that feels alive, where every corner has a story to tell. A truly immersive world draws the player in and makes them feel like their actions are part of something bigger. Cyberpunk 2077 excels at this. Night City is a sprawling, neon-lit metropolis that feels both dystopian and vibrant. But what makes the game's story stand out is how deeply it's tied to the world's corporate politics, social hierarchies, and technological evolution. Every character interaction, every side quest, and every piece of lore feels connected to the greater narrative of a city dominated by powerful factions and the struggle for identity in a world controlled by corporations. So, to summarize, a truly great story in a video game isn't just about creating a narrative. It's about engaging the player on multiple levels. It's about characters who feel like real people, choices that truly matter, a plot that keeps you on the edge of your seat, emotional resonance that leaves a lasting impact, and a world that feels alive and interconnected with the story. When these aspects are working in harmony, the player isn't just completing quests or following a plot, they are living a story. And now that we've established what makes a truly great story, we can begin to examine how Bethesda's most recent titles compare. Do their stories hold up to these standards? Have they delivered characters, choices, and emotional stakes on par with the best of gaming? Or have they fallen short of the narrative potential that we have seen is possible? For all the success in creating expansive, immersive worlds, the core narratives of Starfield, Fallout 4, and Skyrim fall short of the storytelling benchmarks. Each of these games present a vast, intricate world with boundless freedom for the player. Yet, when you peel back the layers, their stories feel thin, their characters shallow, and their choice often meaningless. Let's dive into how each of these games fail to meet the mark on storytelling. One of the biggest areas where all three games struggle is character depth. Characters are the heart of any story. In a great RPG, the characters around you should feel alive. They should change, grow, and challenge you. But in Starfield, Fallout 4, and Skyrim, the characters often feel like static, one-dimensional figures who exist to serve the plot rather than to enrich it. In Starfield, your companions, such as Sarah Morgan and Barrett, are presented as key figures in the exploration of the galaxy. Sarah in particular is positioned as the leader of the constellation and someone with great personal stakes in the mystery surrounding the alien artifacts. But despite this promising setup, Sarah's characters never truly evolve. She remains a mentor figure throughout the game, her dialogue filled with surface-level concerns about exploration and adventure, but we rarely see her grapple with the larger emotional or even philosophical implications of her quest. Her past is touched upon, but it doesn't affect her present in any meaningful way. And the same can be said about Barrett, whose quirky personality remains unchanged throughout the game, never developing beyond his initial introduction. These characters, while serviceable, don't provide the player with a sense of depth or personal connection. Fallout 4 suffers from similar issues. Characters like Piper and Preston Garvey are likable, but they lack complexity that would make them feel truly alive. Preston, in particular, quickly becomes a meme in the gaming community due to his repetitive settlement needs or help missions, which reduces his character to little more than a quest dispenser. Ironically, the non-human synth Nick Valentine is one of the few companions in the base game that actually feel human. And now Skyrim. Despite being one of Bethesda's most beloved games, it arguably handles characters the worst of the three. Characters like Lydia, the ever-loyal housecarl, or Delphine, a member of the Blades, are defined entirely by their roles. Lydia is there to follow you into battle and carry your burdens, and Delphine is focused solely on killing dragons. They don't have personal arcs or moments of significant growth, and their dialogue rarely offers insight into who they are beyond their function to the plot. And that's largely the same for almost every companion in the base game. Even characters like Ulfric Stormcloak, who plays a major role in the game's civil war, remains relatively monotonous. He's either the righteous leader of a rebellion or the stubborn nationalist, depending on your perspective. But there's little nuance to his character beyond that. His dialogue and actions don't do much to sway the player in his favor. In fact, I'd argue that you'll likely have formed an opinion about him before you even meet him, and it's unlikely to change afterwards. Compare this to games like Red Dead Redemption 2 or The Witcher 3, where every major character feels fully realized, with personal stakes that evolve alongside the player's journey. One of the most crucial aspects of a great RPG is giving the player choice that feels significant and impactful. In games like The Witcher 3 or Mass Effect, the decisions you make ripple throughout the whole story, shaping relationships and altering the course of the narrative. But in Bethesda's recent titles, player choice often feels superficial or inconsequential, leaving you with the sense that no matter what you choose, the outcome will be largely the same. In Starfield, this issue is particularly pronounced. The central mystery of the game revolves around ancient alien artifacts, and while the player is given freedom to explore countless planets and join various factions, the main narrative arc remains frustratingly linear. Ultimately, the story marches on towards the same conclusion, regardless of how you play. Fallout 4 presents a similar issue with their faction system. On paper, the idea of choosing between the Brotherhood of Steel, the Railroad, the Minutemen, or the Institute should provide the player with meaningful moral choices. However, in practice, the consequence of your decision feels shallow. Regardless of which faction you align with, the endgame is largely the same. You wipe out the other factions and assume control of your chosen group. There is one hidden ending where, with some effort and careful planning, you can keep many factions alive. However, even this outcome falls short compared to New Vegas, where deciding who leads in the post-apocalypse feels truly impactful. In Skyrim, the issue with inconsequential choices is perhaps most apparent in the Civil War storyline. Whether you side with the Imperials or the Stormcloaks, the end result feels largely cosmetic. The game doesn't present the player with morally complex decisions or show the long-term consequences of the war. Once the conflict is resolved, life in Skyrim continues much as it did before, with little acknowledgement of the player's impact on the world. The Civil War, which should be a defining moment in the game's history, ultimately feels like just another questline, with no significant consequence for the player or the world around them. In all three games, the lack of meaningful choice diminished the player's sense of agency. The world doesn't respond to the actions in ways that feel dynamic or impactful, and the narrative loses much of the weight as a result. A great story needs to maintain tension and build stakes that keep the player invested. In games like The Last of Us or BioShock, the plot constantly raises the stakes, creating a sense of urgency and driving the player forward. However, in Starfield, Fallout 4, and Skyrim, the main storyline often lacks this crucial element of tension. In Starfield's main story, while the premise should be filled with mystery and wonder, the game's narrative fails to build tension effectively. The missions often follow a repetitive pattern: find an artifact, return to Constellation, repeat. There's little to no sense of escalating danger or personal stakes that make the player feel like they're on the brink of a major discovery, one of the only exceptions of this being the first time you encounter the Starborn. Even the introduction of a villainous faction like the Crimson Fleet doesn't raise the stakes significantly. The plot remains focused on the player's journey through space rather than creating a gripping narrative arc that pulls the player in. Fallout 4 sets up what should be a high-stakes emotional journey. However, the story quickly loses its focus. As soon as the player joins one of the game's factions, the personal stakes of finding Sean takes a backseat to the broader conflict between the Institute and the other factions. The tension that should come from a parent's desperate search for their child fizzles out, and the story shifts to a more generic save or destroy the Commonwealth narrative. The urgency of the main quest disappears as the player is drawn into side quests and faction politics, making the overall plot feel disjointed and unfocused. And the most disappointing thing is, they did a better job of what is essentially the same premise in Fallout 3. In Skyrim, the plot should feel epic, but despite the world-ending premise, the main story never builds the tension or stakes it promises. The player can easily ignore the main quest for dozens of hours without any consequences, and Alduin himself never feels like the looming threat he's supposed to be. The lack of urgency undermines the story's stakes, making the plot feel more like a series of errands rather than an epic journey to save the world. A truly great story doesn't just engage you on a narrative level, it resonates emotionally. This emotional connection is what makes certain games stay with us long after we finish them. Unfortunately, none of these Bethesda titles that we've talked about so far manages to evoke this kind of emotional depth. Starfield, for instance, tries to introduce emotional moments through backstories of your companions, but these moments often feel disconnected from the main plot. There's no emotional through-line that ties the player's personal journey to the large narrative. When the player uncovers the truth behind the alien artifacts, it should be a moment of wonder or awe, but the game doesn't build enough emotional momentum for that reveal to land with impact. It's just another step in the player's journey, devoid of any real emotional weight. In Fallout 4, the personal stakes for the player's search of their son could have provided an emotionally charged narrative, but when the player finally finds Sean, the emotional payoff is lackluster. Instead of a heartwarming reunion or a moment of deep conflict, the player is met with a detached, emotionless interaction. Sean, now the leader of the Institute, doesn't evoke the kind of emotional response that should come from discovering your long-lost child in such a morally complicated position. The game misses the opportunity to create a powerful emotional climax, and the story feels hollow as a result. Skyrim is perhaps the weakest in terms of emotional resonance. The main story centers on the Dragonborn's destiny, yet there's little emotional investment in that journey. The player is told they're the chosen one, yet the game never gives them a reason to care about this fate. There's no personal connection to the conflict with Alduin, and the player's relationships with other characters like Delphine or Esbern feel purely fictional. The story lacks the emotional highs and lows that makes the narrative truly memorable. Much of the game feels like the player simply going through the motions. Despite being framed as the savior of Tamriel, the Dragonborn's journey lacks a sense of personal struggle or earned accomplishment. You're handed success at nearly every turn, from effortlessly mastering powerful shouts to receiving praise from NPCs without really having to prove yourself. The journey feels passive, as though you're simply fulfilling checklists of tasks rather than battling personal demons or making tough decisions with meaningful consequence. Even the moments that should be triumphant, defeating Alduin, leading the charge in the Civil War, or becoming the leader of multiple guilds, feel strangely hollow, and there's no emotional payoff for all your victories. You're the chosen one simply because the story says so, and as a result, the player never feels like they've truly earned that title. The lack of struggle or personal growth in the Dragonborn's arc makes it difficult to connect with the story, leaving the player feeling like they're just along for the ride, rather than the driving force of the narrative. Despite their narrative flaws, in my opinion, all three games excel at creating immersive worlds. Starfield offers a massive galaxy filled with planets to explore, Fallout 4 provides a richly detailed post-apocalyptic Boston, and Skyrim presents a vast, mythic land steeped in lore. Bethesda's strength lies in its world building, but the issue is that the narrative within these worlds don't take full advantage of that immersion. In the end, Bethesda's recent titles highlight a shift in focus, one where vastness of the world takes precedence over the depth of the story within it. And while this has led to some of the most expansive open-world RPGs in gaming history, it also led to stories that don't live up to the potential of their setting. Bethesda's most recent releases have fallen short of delivering a truly great story, so to find something remarkable, we have to look further back, and what we find is Oblivion, the last time Bethesda truly succeeded in storytelling. While their more recent games have mastered expansive worlds, Oblivion stands out as the final moment when Bethesda managed to blend a deeply immersive world with a narrative that was compelling, urgent, and emotionally resonant. When we talk about Oblivion, we're talking about a game that hits the perfect balance between player freedom and a strong, coherent story. Unlike its successors, Oblivion managed to weave together an epic narrative that not only has high stakes, but also made the player feel genuinely involved in the world's fate. The plot, the characters, and the choices all came together to create a story that resonated long after the final credits rolled. At the heart of Oblivion's success is its cast of characters, who felt deeply embedded within the narrative. One of the most memorable characters in the game is Martin Septim, voiced by Sean Bean. In the game, Martin starts as a simple priest, unaware of his royal bloodline. But over the course of the story, he undergoes significant character growth, transforming from a reluctant heir to the throne into a determined leader willing to make the ultimate sacrifice for the greater good. His arc is filled with moments of doubt, courage, and ultimately, redemption, which gives the player a powerful emotional connection to his journey. Unlike the largely static companions in Starfield or Fallout 4, Martin's character evolves as the story progresses, and his relationship with the player deepens. By the time the player reaches the climactic final battle against Mehrunes Dagon, Martin's willingness to sacrifice himself to save Tamriel feels earned. The emotional weight of that moment lingers as you watch a character who started with no desire to be a leader become the savior of the world. Similarly, the supporting cast in Oblivion plays a significant role in making the story feel alive. Characters like Joffrey at the head of the Blades are not just quest givers, but individuals with personal stakes in the success of the mission. They're not always the front and center, but they provide a sense of continuity and purpose throughout the game, reinforcing the idea that you're part of something larger than just your personal journey. While Oblivion might not be as choice-driven as some modern RPGs, it still offers players meaningful decisions in how they impact the world. One of the most significant choices is how the player chooses to handle various Daedric quests. These quests often involve morally ambiguous situations, forcing the player to make difficult decisions. Moreover, while the main quest is more linear than games like Mass Effect or Witcher 3, the player's involvement in the Oblivion crisis feels impactful. The quest to close Oblivion gates, for instance, is not just repetitive tasks, but one that grows in significance as you realize the scale of the invasion. Each gate you close feels like a small victory, and through each of these small victories, by the end of the game, the player feels like they've been integral to preventing the destruction of Tamriel. This sense of consequence gives weight to the player's actions, making the main quest feel like more than just a series of tasks. In contrast to Skyrim and Fallout 4, where the choices often feel cosmetic, the civil war in Skyrim plays out almost identically regardless of which side you choose, and Fallout 4's faction quests ultimately lead to the same type of endgame no matter who you support. Oblivion's story is emotionally resonant because it taps into themes of sacrifice, duty, and heroism. The relationship between the player and Martin Septim becomes the emotional core of the narrative, and Martin's transformation from uncertain heir to willing martyr gives the story real emotional weight. Once again, I have to go back to the final moments of the game where Martin sacrifices himself to become the avatar of Akatosh, to banish Mehrunes Dagon. It is the most emotionally powerful moment in Bethesda's catalog. It's not just another boss fight, it's the culmination of Martin's journey and the player's involvement in helping him accept his fate. It's a bittersweet conclusion that sticks with you, in part because the game has spent so much time building Martin as a character to care about. Compare this to Fallout 4, where the emotional climax feels hollow and anticlimactic. Skyrim's main story has a similar problem, and in Starfield, there's really no emotional connection whatsoever. What's truly unique and compelling about Oblivion's story is that despite all your heroic deeds and accomplishments, you aren't the main character. You're simply a key player, but not the central figure. That role belongs to Martin Septim. This twist on the traditional RPG hero narrative adds depth and emotional weight to the story in a way that's rarely seen in Bethesda's more recent titles. As mentioned before, Martin's journey is the emotional core of Oblivion. The player is there to support him, guide him, and protect him, but ultimately, it's his sacrifice that saves Tamriel. This is where Oblivion shines. It understands that great stories aren't just about making the player feel like the all-powerful chosen one. They're about creating relationships and moments that have lasting impacts. And to contrast again with Bethesda's more recent games, the player is often the absolute center of the narrative, which can sometimes feel hollow or self-indulgent. But in Oblivion, you're reminded that even in a story of grand heroism, the greatest victories often come from those around you. and that's what makes Oblivion's narrative stand out as one of Bethesda's finest moments in storytelling. Finally, this might be a bit more subjective, but I feel that Oblivion stands out for how well it integrates its world building into the narrative. The game's setting, Cyrodiil, feels alive and rich with history, culture, and political intrigue. The main quest draws on these elements to create a world that feels interconnected and responsive to the player's actions. For example, the role of the Blades, the Emperor's protectors, is deeply tied to the main narrative, and the game uses political turmoil following the Emperor's assassination to drive the story forward. Oblivion represents the last time Bethesda truly nailed storytelling. The game combined with an epic plot, emotionally resonant characters, and a world that feels both immersive and deeply connected to the main narrative. It's a story that built tensions and stakes, delivered meaningful choices, and left players with a powerful, emotional conclusion. Comparing with Bethesda's more recent releases, Oblivion shows us what Bethesda is capable of when they balance freedom with a strong, compelling narrative. It remains a shining example of how player agency, world building, and storytelling can come together to create something truly memorable. A standard that unfortunately Bethesda has struggled to meet in their recent games. Games like Morrowind and Fallout 3 are further proof that the studio once understood how to craft narrative with depth, urgency, and emotional resonance, but it's Oblivion that for me stands out as the last true testament to Bethesda's storytelling ability. If there's one takeaway from this, is that Oblivion is a must-play. It's a game that doesn't just rely on vast landscapes or freedom, it weaves an epic tale centered around sacrifice, destiny, and the greater good. Bethesda has shown that they can do better, and honestly, it's time that they return to the storytelling roots that made their older games so memorable. Until then, if you want to experience a Bethesda story done right, Oblivion is where you need to start. Thanks for watching, and if you want to see more like this, please subscribe.